I'd like to thank you, Jess, for coming today, all the way from Hastings. We've had a fantastic presentation and a walk around Coalville. So we've shown you the building that we're in, which is Coalville CAN. We've got a creative suite and we're hoping to develop the office space upstairs. Shown you the old co-op, which hopefully we shall have access to very soon, with the option to purchase over the next year. And then we walked all the way around to Hermitage Lakeside, where we showed you the leisure centre that's currently boarded up. So I just wondered, after having your first experience in Coalville, have you got any initial reflections on what you've seen today?
I think it's great. I think what you're doing is amazing. I suppose I remember some of it. I remember being in similar positions where everything is opening up and there's great opportunities. The only reason you're in this position is because you've all worked so hard to get here. I think you've got a long way to go still, as we have. It's really exciting to see the positive responses that you're being able to bring to the town, given that there's some pretty awful things going on, as there is in most towns. That, you know, seeing leisure centres closed when new ones are open always really upsets me. What was the plan? Why was the plan not implemented as part of building the new one? Why is it always left until much later? And this is not just here at all. This happens in lots of places. But what's great is that despite those, and of course the co-op being closed and being blighting the high street at the moment, it feels like if only you could have been allowed to start sooner with some of these things or get on with it faster, then that blight would never happen at all. And you would be part of the answer from the beginning. That's where I feel like we ought to get. In the meantime, you are doing exactly the right thing by being ambitious about what the people of this town can do for the town. I think it's great that there's a number of buildings. Some of them will happen faster than others, and you can't always predict in advance what's going to happen first. And what quite often happens is that they all take quite a long time and then they all come up at once, like buses. So you need to be ready for that. That's going to be challenging, but you absolutely seem to me to be totally up for it and capable of it.
I'd like to introduce, we've got Ian and Dan in the room as well. Dan's from Jump Parkour, we managed to persuade him over the last 4 or 5 months to come to Coalville, so now it's parkour on his website is Coalville, Coventry and Leicester. So we're trying to put Coalville on the map all the time. And Dan wants to set up the National Parkour Centre, and I just wondered if you want to say a few words about what that means and why you think the space that is the hall of the current leisure centre is the place to do it.
So as Dina said, I run Jump Parkour, and as also said, we coach in Leicester. That's where we started, Coventry, and then with a little bit of elbows out, moved to Coalville as well. I have to say the uptake in Coalville has been incredible. Like, the enthusiasm from the community has been brilliant. Everyone's been getting on really well. When I first saw the hall in Hermitage Leisure Centre, and you kind of whispered in my ear that, you know, maybe we could potentially one day turn this into a parkour gym, just the fact that the dimensions of it suit it perfectly. You know, it has acres of height, which most spaces for parkour don't have. You have the option to obviously build probably world-leading equipment in there due to its dimensions and spaces. You have the opportunity to run teaching and coaching qualifications, so the opportunity to mentor young people from being students learning the discipline all the way through to coaches themselves, the opportunity to run national events. Like, all of this stuff could be done quite easily in that space. So I think, you know, to me it's a no-brainer to use that hall for our purpose, but I'm slightly biased, but I think I can convince others still.
What will it take to turn it into that national centre?
Oh, a fair bit of cash. In terms of knowledge base, our organisation has it all. So I'm involved with the design of parkour parks nationally anyway.
Right.
So being able to design something that's both eye-catching, inclusive and useful, not a problem. In terms of coach education, I've delivered probably 80 to 90% of the coach education for parkour in the UK over the last 2 years, so sorted. In terms of coaches, we have a bunch of those with new people coming through the pipeline on the way. So really, you just need maybe a little bit of funding to help us convert a space of that size into something that I think not only local people can enjoy, but parkour practitioners nationally and even internationally.
Yeah. Well, finding people like Dan is what we do, isn't it? It's finding the energy, finding the passion, and the specialist approach that will fit the buildings. So it's great that you're looking at it. What it will take is political will, and I hope that that's in place.
So what benefits would you say parkour bring to the community? Because some people don't really understand what it is, and some people will say it's about jumping on buildings and trying. Yeah, so what would you say to that?
The first thing I'd say to these people is perhaps find a parkour coach or an expert that actually can tell you what it is, rather than watching a YouTube video that says like world's best parkour or parkour fails 2022 or something like that, because the chances are the message of those videos is just to get views and doesn't actually educate anybody on what the sport actually is. It's not an adrenaline sport, it's not a risk sport. The injury rate is surprisingly low, especially compared to almost other mainstream sports. In fact, we've managed to convince the government of this as well, and we have recognition as a sport with the government the same standing as things like gymnastics or basketball. So I think in terms of where parkour's positioned now, we're starting to convince people of what it actually is, and it has a whole host of benefits, from physical literacy for kids, confidence building. So we've had people come in just seen parkour, maybe thought it's interesting, never thought they would do any of the movements in their life. We'll teach them, obviously with our expert tuition, they'll do these things safely, and just the look on their face, they'll do something they never thought they would ever do. Yeah. And then, that's just the start of their journey, and then you'll progress them from there. It's really good for helping people be challenge and risk positive. So you'll be aware of like how you react in a difficult situation. There is a little bit of facing fear in parkour, but it's never without context. So if you look at something scary, it's because you've done all the preparations for that challenge, everything in the periphery. That's the stuff you don't see in the videos that happens at the classes and the sessions. So you do all the preparations, then you look at a challenge, and then you make a very rational decision whether you do it or not. And it's all very controlled and very measured, and that's part of the message we try and get out.
And risk positive, that's a great phrase, both for that kind of activity, but also for the kind of work that we do in taking these buildings and so on, because you have to take a positive approach to risk.
Sure.
In both cases. It seems to me it suits very nicely.
Yeah.
We have I think it's Europe's biggest indoor skate park in Hastings. It was an old swimming baths on lots of different levels, and it's called Source Park, and they have a very similar kind of approach. And what I found so interesting about them was you kind of have a stereotype that it's all going to be teenage boys or something, and it so isn't. You see lots of little girls, 5, 6, 7-year-olds with dad often, spending their weekends together. Instead of dad sitting there with a can of lager on the beach with this 6-year-old, there he is, working with her, learning how to do BMXing or skating or whatever. And I'm sure, I hope it would be similar, a wide range of people.
Yeah, exactly. So our we run a couple of sessions on a Wednesday night. They'll be coaching later, and our 12 to 16, age 12 to 16 class is one of our most diverse classes of our weekly group of sessions. So it's about 50-50 boys and girls, which is really, really good for a sport, parkour, which has a mostly perception of being male dominated, and also just people from lots of different backgrounds as well. So it's one of my favorite ones to teach because it's so diverse, and the best part about it is the community and cohesion between the groups. It's fantastic. I'm smiling now thinking about how fun it is to teach. So yes, making it so that we can show that parkour is accessible to all and something anyone can do is a huge part of what we're about. And
is it going to be an Olympic sport, or is that an aspiration?
Well, that's a question. I actually hope not, because it's not a sport you can win. So you can't categorically be the best at parkour. So yes, people do compete in parkour, but the aim of it is not to win. The aim of it is to succeed. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So it's you versus the challenge that you're doing, or you versus where you were last week. Yeah. You can't really categorically say someone's better at facing challenges than somebody else.
No.
So
that's a great answer. So we don't actually want it to be an Olympic sport, but we do want to challenge people to challenge themselves.
Yes.
To take that next challenge for themselves. Brilliant. And obviously there's a lot more to the Hermitage Centre as well as the parkour. What else are you going to do there?
Well, I was just thinking about the funding model that we've put together in terms of people like Dan having the expertise in their area, and people like Sam who built skate parks, and your example in Hastings sounds amazing. It's in an old swimming pool as well, so it probably worth visiting.
Yeah.
That's sort of the thing we were thinking of for the swimming pool and the changing areas, because we know they were all semi-derelict anyway, so that would be an easy exchange, so to speak. In terms of the funding model, it's having experts like Dan and Sam running their own areas. So I was just going to ask Dan about the number of jobs and opportunities it might create. In our funding model, we've included an element of rent, which Dan's group would pay towards the overall model, plus the number of jobs that would be created. So I didn't know what your thoughts are on that.
I guess it would be just essentially how many sessions you could run at the same time. So currently most of our sessions are run at a ratio of about kind of 9 or 10 to 1 coach. So Leicester sessions, 3 coaches, 30 students. Sometimes we have newer coaches being trained up in the environment of volunteers as well to kind of reduce those ratios a bit more. So I think there's no reason why we couldn't have a couple of classes of that size run at the same time, which would be 6 coaches on at the same time, someone to man the front desk, somebody there maybe doing a managerial role, and then obviously you'd have a larger workforce of coaches that would be able to deliver your kind of whole weekly timetable, because you wouldn't just have the same 6 people day in, day out all of the time. They might get a bit tired and might need some breaks. So I think there'd be a fair few jobs we could create using a space of that size.
And the other part of what you asked was what else would be on site. So as well as parkour and skating, we're talking about accommodation. So providing affordable accommodation for people that work there, a caretaker for the site, coaches that might be there, even a visiting coach, that type of thing. Plus, in our listening to the community, we've also put in there a gaming centre, and that's about getting young people out of their houses who perhaps would be at home on their own doing gaming, coming together with a community hub in the middle, so that the community hub can see all these different things that are going on. Kids who come to do gaming could interact with the parkour and the skating, and the whole thing would sort of come together. Is our vision for Hermitage.
That's great. It sounds really exciting. That's an interesting way of putting it. How can government ensure? I mean, I love that. My favourite quote about partnerships is they're too often the suppression of mutual loathing in pursuit of cash. That is too often what a partnership has been, whereas the partnership work we do in Hastings is based on shared values. We do not partner with people that do not share our values. It's not a real partnership if you do. So actually, really, it's not up to government to there's not much, I don't think, that government can do to ensure genuine partnership. But perhaps what they could do is talk a little bit more about what that they would like to see, genuine partnerships based on shared values where people have spent time talking in advance. Because if you put together a partnership to write a bid because you're told to by government, that will not be a genuine partnership. If you put it together to reshape your town over a period of a decade or two, that's a different matter, and that then has a chance for people to have the conversations, to see where their differences lie. Shared values doesn't mean no difference of opinion, it just means some fundamental values about community, and the benefit of the work that we're going to do together must be real. That's what really matters, rather than we will work together and win money. It's such a big difference, but it's so important that I'm really sad that partnerships are still being put together and funded that are just completely fake. They really are, all over the country. And everybody knows it, including the people in those partnerships, but this is the way the game is played, and until the game is played differently, I don't think there's much point in government putting out guidance on partnerships. A lot of what I'd say is our work is DIY regeneration. We've seen millions and millions of pounds spent in Hastings on the wrong things. So grade A office blocks for corporate headquarters that never came. So those properties were then put into liquidation. They were then bought out of liquidation by the University of Brighton, who used them for a few years, then decided they didn't want to stay in Hastings, and now they are selling those publicly funded blocks and for millions of pounds, and they'll get to take that money away. It was never a proper partnership in the first place, and the neighbourhood and the people of the town have suffered from that experience. So I suppose, get on with it ourselves. Don't wait for a benevolent policy, don't wait for a government announcements. Get on with your work and continually stay open to working with others who share your values, and keep talking about your values so that you attract people who share those. There are lots of people who share the kinds of values that I've seen today in Coalville. What drives you? What's your driving passion, motivation that keeps you going with this?
It's just so exciting, and it's just the right thing to do. So to see this building buzzing with people after 5 years, these curtains have been shut, and suddenly you've got people coming in and sharing their art that have not had the chance to do it before, or putting something on a shelf and selling it, or just coming for a chat. It's just opened up. It's just such a really nice environment that we've sort of helped create, and then hope people will take it on.
Yeah.
And the same thing looking at Hermitage, it's just such a massive opportunity to do something incredible that will last forever.
Mm-hmm. So it's that mixture of the current waste, like the curtains closed kind of sense, that's a wasted opportunity, a space that could be doing something good and isn't, and then the contrast once you can open the doors. And of course you don't just open the doors, do you? I've seen you both out talking to people, everybody that we pass, you're talking to them. So it's not just about opening the doors, it's about being out there, being open as people as well as buildings.
I think partly it's that seeing people growing in self-belief and confidence, growing in their ability to shape their lives and the lives of their family and neighbours for the better.
Yeah.
And I think that's an essential requirement for healthy and happy communities. And I think along with that ability to shape your community, you need the assets. So it all goes together. We need people to have the self-confidence in themselves, self-confidence in the community, to connect, but then that the money they spend is spent locally, it circulates locally, and they have a feeling that they're shaping their own community and reducing the impact of outside forces.
Absolutely. So some sense of agency, of that I can make something happen. I might not be able to do it on my own,
Absolutely.
but with other people I can make something happen.
And I think that people get stuck with two models. One is, who's going to do that for me?
Mm-hmm.
Or I can't do it unless the council does it or the government does it,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm trying to do it by myself. Well, actually, if we do it with each other, we can outperform anyone else. I think the other key element is people are used to being told what to do or being treated as customers and consumers rather than as citizens. And that's back to the agency point, the self-belief in us as a community to make our own decisions and shape our own communities for the better. And seeing that energy and that self-belief, that's what gives the buzz.
Yeah. And maybe vice versa. There are many, many citizens who do not understand the governance of local authorities either. So, of course, we all as citizens want to understand the processes of decision making, i.e. the governance of those bodies that impact us, whether they are state bodies or voluntary sector or independent in whatever way. Understanding the way decisions are made goes way beyond understanding specific legal structures. So it's not all about specific legal structures, they're just the tools. And in fact, our variety of legal structures gives us a great variety of opportunity to make a difference. So we have a community land trust, which is a community benefit society, which I know is the same as Coalville CAM. And a community benefit society is, as we know, a wonderful approach to being able to reach lots of people who don't just become names on a list, but actually become owners of that, stakeholders, shareholders in that community business. So we have a community benefit society, but we also have a more traditional registered charity, and we have a social enterprise property developer. And those three work together very closely to achieve this big, ambitious goal. And I suppose what I would say about that is I do get the point about it needs to be simple, it needs to be understandable, but also it needs to be effective. And sometimes you need a range of tools. You know, you can't just have a hammer. You need the screwdriver, you need the lawnmower, you need all kinds of different sorts of tools to be able to achieve what we're trying to achieve. In terms of what often that kind of question is getting at is who is served by this, or who can participate. And that's why I think the Community Benefit Society is a really good element within it overall, because Community Benefit Society, almost anybody can participate. People can choose to join. Obviously, you need to do quite a lot of marketing of that. You need to actually explain, tell people that they have that opportunity to join. But then, then those members elect directors. Usually at the start, there will be a group of founding trustees or directors who will set the thing up in the first place. And so they won't be elected, they will have sort of stepped forward. I always love the American version of what a community leader is. In this country we think community leaders, quite often we mean head teachers or vicars or somebody who's got a particular status, whereas in America a community leader is somebody who steps forward to take action. So it's anybody who will step forward to take action on behalf of and with the community. And we should be glad and grateful for community leadership, for those people, whoever they are, stepping forward, rather than, as too often happens, calling them the usual suspects. As soon as somebody puts their head above the parapet, oh yeah, you're just the usual suspects. And that is one of the quickest ways to take away someone's agency, is to just sort of downgrade them and say, oh yeah, you're just the same, you're just somebody who's stepped forward. Stepping forward is such a powerful and important thing to do. So there's lots of different things in there, but I would say, of course, we need to be able to explain how decisions are made, who makes them, and how other people can influence them. Councils should do the same. Well, I think what's interesting about post-Grenfell is that the reaction to Grenfell, of course, has been dramatic and has been essential. However, it has impacted on buildings that are nothing like Grenfell. So we have a 7-storey massive concrete building, which is very, very safe, has no cladding, it's completely fireproof, basically. And yet, because it's over 18 metres high, it is treated as if it was Grenfell. And that is just inappropriate and adds an almost impossible level of regulation and rules unnecessarily. Whereas actually there are buildings that are like Grenfell all over the country and that need to be focused on. Of course you meet your statutory responsibilities. You know, I said it was very difficult. We are meeting every single responsibility. Of course you do. I suppose there's this idea that community groups, that somehow, 6 or 10 people, volunteers, are going to suddenly start taking on those responsibilities. And that's not how the voluntary sector works. The voluntary sector has voluntary management. That doesn't mean it doesn't have any staff. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any expertise. It has paid people and it reaches out to buy in the necessary expertise, always. So it's not that we're expecting Ethel down the road to run the fire checks. We're not, unless she gets really good at it, in which case she can, But she needs to go on some training. She needs to do, So, it's a kind of stereotype of the voluntary sector that it's amateur, and it's not amateur. We are as professional as any other sector, and a great deal more so. The more local you are, the more focused you are on meeting your responsibilities. And of course, one of the problems with Grenfell was that the tenant management organisation had stopped being locally rooted and locally accountable and became responsible for 10,000 homes. You cannot be locally accountable in that way, and you can't be on top of everything in that way if you've got 10,000 homes. So that local by default, that small scale approach is actually much safer. I believe that every tenant in our buildings is safer than people in buildings that are managed by organisations that manage tens of thousands of buildings, because we know every tenant, we know every light switch, we know every risk in those buildings, and we manage them all the time.
I'd say we'd go over and above.
Way over and above,
of
course.
And improvement.
I think geographical scale can vary. I began my presentation with this focus on the fine grain, and I'm really interested in the fine grain, really small scale neighbourhood, because that's the human scale. That's the area where the neighbours know more than the council. They know more than some strategic planner, because the strategic planner is looking at a much wider view, whereas the neighbours are walking up and down and, you know, experiencing everything about that place day in, day out. So I'm really interested in that way, because you sort of turn the power upside down. Nevertheless, of course, that it can expand beyond that to especially in a town like this, which is bounded by countryside. It's a very clear town. I think you have about 35,000 people, something like that. So I would say that's very doable, to have your kind of activity across the town, but that in each place you engage with the immediate neighbourhood, and the best way to do that always is through occupation, through just being able to actually be in the space and to let people come into the space and experience the space, preferably over a couple of years is my preference is always before, not necessarily before you buy, because you may need to buy because of whatever the deal you're doing is, but either before you buy or before you do all the renovation, you take some time in the building with local people from the immediate area and others to try things out, experience what it feels like to be in that building, how the noise works, you know, how the locks work, how the practicalities of everything work, and exactly what you want to do next, rather than, as we're so often forced to do, develop a detailed plan in advance of every last thing that we're going to change physically and every social activity we're going to run, and project that 30 years into the future. You know, that kind of planning is just totally inappropriate for what we're doing. Frederick Laloux talks about, you know, if you're getting on a bicycle, you don't write a business plan first. You get on the bicycle, you set off, you wobble a bit, you adapt to the environment as that environment changes. If the weather changes, you adapt your style of cycling. You definitely don't write a plan before you set out. And that's how I see it much more. It's like going for a bike ride. It's, you know, and you have to be adaptable. You're going forward in good faith with strong values and with integrity, but not with a detailed plan that you're then going to have to stick to. I mean, especially if you have to stick to it. It's one thing to have a plan and then to adapt and say the plan's changed, but too often with funding, you are meant to stick to it, and you have to spend endless time justifying any divergence from that plan, whereas that's not how it works. We have, twice a year, we have funders' tours to the Hastings Commons, and it's really interesting what they say afterwards. At the end of it, we all sit round and say, you know, what will you take away from this? And so often what they say is, we're not doing it right. They literally understand that their funding approaches don't work, and partly that's because a lot of funding approaches are based on single projects. So they are funding this one project, whether it's one building or one activity within one building. And yet when they come and look round, they realise that even if that was that one activity they were funding, actually what they were getting for it was a great deal more, and therefore it's worth trying to adapt their processes a bit because they're getting so much more than they would if they just fund a single thread. How they adapt their processes is not easy. It's all about trust. And so funders need to understand that treating everybody exactly the same is not equitable, just as the same in the kind of equalities, diversity and inclusion field, that treating everyone the same isn't equitable. Treating everybody that you fund, whether you've never heard of them before or whether you've been working with them for 10 years, it's clearly they're not the same. So some of our funders now are starting to talk about building up relationships with trusted organisations over time, and then reducing the amount of, or changing their expectations of those funded projects over time, and hopefully starting to see common style work where you're intervening in multiple buildings, and it's not just about the building, it's about community building. It's about creating connections between people. I think once people start to understand that better, they will, over time, work out better processes to support it. But that first concept of, there are funders in the States actually, foundations in the States that fund community organising. They always ask for a plausible approach to engaging with people and a clarity about the kinds of issues that are present in your community, but not a full plan about what you're going to do about it. So as long as you can be convincing that you will engage with people and that you broadly understand the kinds of issues that are around, then you're worth funding. Rather than you have to tell them, you're going to support 15 people into, I don't know, or you're going to make sure people eat more broccoli and pass their exams. Is that whole thing about community organising is that you go out without an agenda, without a message. You the organiser, are not taking a message to other people. The only message you're taking is, I'm listening. What is it you want to say? What is it you want to do? And how can we do that together? How is it different from other models? I mean, it depends what other models you mean, I suppose, but how is it different from other regeneration processes? Some of what we've been saying about it is more humble about knowing what's going to happen. The idea is that my strong belief is that regeneration is a kind of art, not a science, and that it's entirely unpredictable. That your interventions the impact of your interventions is unpredictable, but that what we need to do, if we go forward in good faith and with integrity, then we will create great outcomes. We just don't know what those outcomes are yet. So that is a different model from most approaches. In terms of other institutions, it depends on their values. If their values align with local people, and if they align with the idea of let's make benefit right now rather than promise something for 10, 15 years' time. That's one of my very strongly held beliefs is in meanwhile, is that I hate master plans. I hate master plans anyway, but I particularly hate the fact that they get written and then they sit on the shelf, but they blight places in the meantime, because people who want to do something interesting, it doesn't fit within the broader master plan. Eventually all this will be demolished, so there's nothing you can do about it for now. And of course it doesn't get demolished or rebuilt or anything for 10, 15 years. Some child who is 4 or 5 when the master plan is written will have left home by the time the thing happens. And of course by the time it happens it will be completely different from what they said it was. Global crises will have got in the way, all kinds of stuff will have changed. And maybe actually now we're all coming to understand that a bit more, because we live in such a crisis-driven world now, in every field. Maybe people are getting to understand a bit more that we are not in control in the same way as was thought. But what we can control is our own attitude to the place and to each other. And so let's focus on that attitude, on some DIY, some strong sense of agency, try and fail. Some things won't work, so give it a go anyway. It's worth a try. It's not worth spending £30 million on something and then it fails, but it's definitely worth spending even £30,000, but definitely £3,000 or 30 quid. You know, let's just give it a go. Let's open the doors. Let's try things. So I think maybe there is a time now and coming where the crisis, the sense of crisis, can actually be harnessed as a sense of let's just try. And if universities can, I mean, I've recently finished written my thesis and finished my PhD. It's been really interesting. It's been really, really important for me to have that kind of academic challenge to a lot of my thinking, which before that was very much from practice. So I think there's a great space for academic challenge to community-led regeneration, but equally the other way round, that I hope my thesis has challenged some academic thinking about what regeneration is. I don't know if that gives enough answer to the institutions. I mean, institutions should be supporting people, shouldn't they? They should be supporting the activity of citizens. That is my belief, whether they are councils or universities or banks or any institutions. They should be focused on, are they adding value to local people's agency and power? And if they ask themselves that question every morning, as they went to work, as people went to work in these different institutions, or every time they're making decisions together, perhaps some of the decisions would be different. I don't think I would take any risk with no expectations. It depends what you mean. If you mean financial, if that question means financial expectations, we take lots of risks with very low financial return expectations, but only because we believe that the risk is worth taking because the return will be in social value. It will come back in social benefit. I mean, I've taken personal risks. So in order to buy Rock House, I remortgaged my house and put 85,000 extra on the mortgage and put that money in to the project, to Rock House. And I did that really deliberately to try to test whether people like myself with unearned equity in a house that we've been lucky enough to buy a house in the 90s, and it had gone up ridiculous amounts, much more than I'd ever earned in the period since then. What could I do with that value? I didn't want to sell the house, but what could I do with that value? And it turned out I could take that, increase my mortgage and put that value into social activity locally. In theory, that might come back. I hope, and I'm not sure about believe, but I hope that at some point the Community Land Trust will buy out the original investors, one of those being me, and I'll be able to pay off that mortgage and get more back. But it'll be probably 20 years from the moment of that mortgage to the moment of the share transfer, and it may or may not be a reasonable amount of money, and we don't know what that money will be worth by then because of inflation. So there's a huge numbers of risks in that, but it's been great fun. It's been fantastically rewarding. And it has proved that it is possible to use that unearned equity for good. There is £10 trillion worth of UK household wealth in mortgages and pensions. Individuals, not companies, individual held wealth in this country. If we could release a tiny fraction of that money into social good, it would be bigger than all the funders that are available out there. It would be amazing. So I think we should start to find a de-risked version of that. So it will still be risky, but slightly less risky than I took on, version so that people who own their home could release a small fraction of that wealth. And there needs to be a model for that. There needs to be an approach for that, and I don't have that yet. It will need to be looked into in a lot more detail. But I was trying it out. So I think the answer as well is that people can take risks depending on what else they've got going on in their lives. You know, depending on whether they have that, you know, whether they're lucky enough to own what is basically a block of gold. You know, these houses, because of the way that house prices have been continually propped up by state policy for the last 20 years, these things are investment assets. Even if we live in them and love them and feel of them, think of them as home, they are also an investment asset, and the question is who for? And I believe that the value is going up because government has held the value for so long. That is, the who for has to be society, not individuals. You're doing this great mixture of things, aren't you? You've got these big projects that you want to push forward with that are really exciting. But today what I've really seen is you're doing stuff right now all the time, including kind of street art and constantly looking for opportunities to work with other people in the town to improve things for their buildings as well as your own. And I think that's really important. The stuff you do has to constantly move between the right now, the quite soon, and the long-term future, and you're constantly shifting your focal length almost between those things, and they feed each other. Those different things feed each other. So somebody walks in here next Tuesday and starts just says, "Oh, I'm interested in creative writing." Then later they will become a trustee, or they'll become involved. They'll become a member of staff, a volunteer, or they'll just come up with a brilliant idea that nobody else has thought of yet. So that work, the day-to-day work of just chatting to people and welcoming people, is so much part of the long stuff as well as the immediate stuff. They're all intertwined. You're doing it all right. Just keep going.
Thanks, Jess.
You know, this is going to take a long time. Enjoy it along the way, I suppose, is the advice. Don't think we've got to get to this future point and then everything will be all right. You have to enjoy it along the way. I was given a brilliant piece of advice by Jim Fields, who's a sort of veteran Chicago community organiser, about it's a long way between getting in the pool and finishing the gala. You need an ice cream after the first width. I just love that.